As we move through life, we all have experiences that teach us lessons. And it turns out that how I engage with much of life is through those lessons. There are times when lessons provoke us to move forward. There are times when those lessons are wonderful and engaging. And there are times where I have wanted to cry out and say, enough with the lessons. Let me absorb the lessons that I've already learned before you give me any more lessons. But what I have found is that I am more present when I intentionally look for the lessons in my experiences. Let me say that again. I am more present to my experiences when I am looking for lessons in those experiences. I don't know about you, but so often things just sort of fly by. I go through the day, I go through experiences, and they just sort of blam off me. But when I am intentionally looking for a lesson, or when I reflect back, I recognize that I have been more present. And that does make sense. We all recognize that some of these lessons are transparent and very accessible. You touch a hot burner, you go, don't do that again. That's a lesson. Some lessons are more opaque, and some lessons we really have to dig to find. But overall, this understanding has led me to intentionally seek out experiences, lessons in the experiences of life. Now, fortunately, my previous congregations seem to like me sharing lessons. I've done sermons on National Youth Event. I've done sermons on mission trips to Harlan County, Kentucky, Yakima, Washington, Nicaragua. I have done sermons on lessons of being a first-time grandparent. Traveled to Thailand, New York, Myanmar, Nicaragua. They liked hearing about the lessons that I picked up from encounters with bioluminescent algae and hurricanes, and even some of the steps on my faith journey. Since identifying lessons are the way that I experience, that I am present to my experiences, I spent a lot of time during the pandemic trying to find lessons in that chaos. Trying to find lessons not only in the chaos, but in the solitude, in the isolation. What were those lessons that I could identify, that I could move forward with, that would change how I perceived the world? Now, during the pandemic, I think many of us missed in-person worship. That was hard. It was really hard to go from full-on being in worship to sitting in your own room with your computer. Especially for somebody who does not have a voice. I can't carry a tune in a bucket. Songs, hymns, I really missed because I didn't sing, because I didn't want to hear myself. But we were all on mute, so I couldn't even hear the voices of the other. But what I grieved the most through all of that was not sharing communion in community. There was something just wrong about sitting in front of my computer screen with my little cup of juice and my little pile of naan or ciabatta or Mike's Power Seed bread, whatever I had available, alone. Because communion to me is just that, being in communion with each other, being in community with each other. And as I was working through that, I found the question coming up time and time again, why? Why did I find communion alone so disturbing? And so I started digging. Trying to find out, trying to look intentionally at my previous communion experiences and the lessons that had come out of those experiences. And that's what I want to share with you this morning, some of my findings from these communion stories. So the first lesson, I got to be honest, I was a church geek from the age of 4. I loved everything about church. I loved the music, I loved the choir, I loved the fancy robes, I loved the flowers, and I loved the big pipe organ. I had a special place in my heart for Mr. Titus. He was the head usher. He was tall, he had white hair. I just loved Mr. Titus. Catherine, the organist, scared the bejesus out of me. She would pound that organ like nobody's business. I'm surprised the organ even stood after a Sunday morning. But I loved it all until it came to the first Sunday of the month. I was raised in a denomination that required a profession of faith before you participated in communion. And so the first Sunday of the month was always challenging for me because I sat at the kids' table. I would sit there between my mom and dad, and my mom would take the communion plate, and we had these little crackers. They were little puffy crackers. And she would take hers and hold it and pass it to me, and I passed it on to my dad, and he'd take his little puffy cracker, and on it went. And communion juice was the same way. She'd take the little cup, I'd pass it on, and Dad would take the little cup. And I always felt left out. I always felt like I'm not one of them. And so this was not a church that you went forward and answered the altar call when you were little. But at 8 years old, I didn't tell anybody I was going to do it. The altar call comes, I stand up, and I go forward. And they're like, what do we do with this? So I got to sit through all of the new member classes with all the grown-ups. And then I came to baptism, and the font was about this high in the water. I thought I was going to drown. But that allowed me to sit in the pew that first Sunday of communion, and when the plate came to my mom, she took the little pillow cracker, and I took the little pillow cracker, and my dad took the little pillow cracker, and I expected to feel so different because now I was in. I was one of them. But I didn't feel any different. So even at that young age of 8 years old, I realized God doesn't have a kids' table. Everybody is invited to God's table. So that's the first lesson, is that the table is open to everyone. All of God's creation is welcome at the table. The next lesson came several years later when I was director of children and family ministries at a church that did not require the profession of faith, but also did not encourage children to participate in communion. And I, as director of children and family ministries, I thought this was odd, so I went to the council and I said, why? And they go, oh, well, we have a history. You've all heard that. Oh, we have a history. And I'm like, that doesn't sit well with me. So I decided that, but I thought, okay, I'll pursue this a little further. So I went to the elders, and I said, so tell me about the history. Well, that was before my time. Well, we don't really remember. I'm like, okay, this is not working for me at all. So I went to council, and I said, you know, we're going to change history. And here's how we're going to do that. We are going to spend 4 to 6 weeks teaching children from kindergarten through elementary school about communion, not just our own communion, but other denominations' communion. We're going to talk to them about what communion is, what it represents. We're going to really dig into communion. We're even going to teach them about how different churches take communion and how our church takes communion. We're going to have pretend communion in this program. And at the end, those children are going to, if they want to, serve communion during worship. Well, I knew that I had to give them an out because I knew that the rock was falling. And so I said, and here's the deal. If in fact we don't feel that the children are ready, we don't have to do this. It's okay. Flash forward 6 weeks. These little kids showed up. They made Easter look dull. The little girls had their hair curled, big bows, shiny patent leather shoes. The little boys were in khakis and cut and sewn shirts. Some had ties. One little kindergartner even showed up in a suit. And they stood up in front and they knew exactly what they were doing, and they were so humble and they were so tender. And people went forward and they took communion, and hearing these little voices say, "The bread of life broken open for you." I still get teary. The cup of blessing, the cup of the new covenant, how we are to be together. And what I observed was that as people left the communion, they were wiping their eyes. So the second lesson is be open. Be open to the unexpected. Communion is an opportunity for mystery to open up. Be open to that. The third lesson came from an oops. It was the first time that I was to preside over communion, and I was scared. I had made it all the way through seminary, all the way through 5 years, and never had to serve communion or preside over communion. I don't know if I didn't feel worthy. I don't know if I was afraid that I was going to forget the words of institution or the prayer of blessing or the prayer of thanksgiving. I was just afraid. I was afraid that the bread wouldn't break the way it was supposed to, and I'd stand there and look silly. I was totally afraid that I was going to spill the juice everywhere. So I don't really know why. I can't pinpoint exactly, but I had avoided this for 5 years. And here it was in, and I couldn't get out of it. So I'm standing up there, and we've made it through the words of institution. We've made it through the cup of the blessing of the elements, and we're standing there, and the first people, and I'm holding the naan, and I'm holding the juice, and the first person comes forward, and I'm thinking, oh, I've made it. All I have to do is the cup of the blessing or the thanksgiving at the end. We're good. And they take the naan and they dip it in the grape juice and they put it in their mouth. I don't know if I have ever seen such a horrified face in my life. And of course, it's all about me. So I'm thinking, I did the blessing wrong and it turned the grape juice to vinegar. I didn't know what was going on. And then I thought, oh, step back, get out of your way. It was just this one person having an experience. So next person comes forward, they break off the naan, they dip it in the grape juice, they put it in their mouth, and again, time after time after time, every person is like, and going on. And I'm dying. Made it through the prayer of Thanksgiving. We're in the fellowship hall, and I'm like, I go up to the senior pastor, and I said, what did I do wrong? And he goes, oh, you don't know what happened? I go, no. It was garlic naan. If you ever want to really taste something disgusting, take some garlic naan and dip it in grape juice. Oh, it was awful. I tried it. It was awful. But the lesson for me was sometimes life and sometimes faith and sometimes our relationship with God and sometimes our relationship with others is bitter. Sometimes it just doesn't taste real good. And you know what? That's okay. God is still present even through those bitter times. 2 more. 4th lesson came shortly after I graduated from seminary. I was providing pulpit supply for a small church that professed to be very flexible in liturgy and worship. Now, any church that professes to be that, you ought to, moving forward, red flag. So I'm sitting there, we've made it through, the whole service had been bumpy. The bulletin did not match what they were doing. And so I was continually trying to, play pinball. And so we come to communion and I'm going, how bad can this be? Just, So I'm sitting there and sitting next to the liturgist, and in the bulletin it says invitation to the table. I can do that. So I start to stand up and I'm wearing a suit, and all of a sudden this hand grabs the back of my suit jacket and pulls me down. And she goes, we don't do that. Okay. And some gentleman stands up and does the invitation to the table. Great. He did a beautiful job. So I'm sitting there thinking, I wonder what's going to happen next. So pretty soon a little bit of silence and nothing's happening. So I'm still sitting there and my jacket is pulled again up. And she goes, do the words of institution. Okay. So I did the words of institution and I did the blessing of the elements, and I'm just totally trying to figure out what to do here. So I'm standing there, and this was the strangest communion I'd ever participated in. I'm standing there, and the ushers bring 4 people forward, and they walk around the table 3 times. And then they take communion. Well, I am standing between the chancel and the table, and I'm in their way. So I thought, okay, I'm going to go sit down. So I go back and sit down, and I'm like, okay. And so, we've done this 4 people forward, 3 times around, serve communion, 4 people forward, 3 times around. It just kept going on. And finally, the people that were unable to come forward had been served, and I'm thinking, okay, time for the prayer of thanksgiving. Got this. So I start to stand up, and you know what's going to happen next? Pull back down into my chair. And the choir stands up and does this beautiful prayer of thanksgiving. It was a gorgeous choir piece. And I'm like, oh, this is marvelous. Way better than any words that I could give. And I'm sitting there and sort of thinking, okay, they're going to stand up, we're going to do the hymn, the benediction, we're through. And all of a sudden, do the prayer of thanksgiving. Well, we just did the prayer of thanksgiving. You sang the prayer of thanksgiving. So I get up and I do that. I was about 3 hours from home. And so I had a lot of time to ponder what had just happened. And one of the things that I recognized is that I didn't feel like I had worshiped. I didn't feel like I had been present to communion. And that got me thinking, I wonder about visitors. I wonder about people that weren't dyed-in-the-wool church people. How would they have experienced this? And what I came up with is, be careful not to let the logistics and the protocol get in the way of spirit. Be careful not to let the way that we worship, the way that we share communion, obscure the why. One final communion story. My last church was down in the Florida Keys, It was a church that was rebounding from a pastor who unfortunately had some medical issues and got into painkiller addiction. And as her world became more chaotic and she lost control, she began to try to take more control. So the church was really used to a very dictatorial type of pastor. When I got there, I decided that they needed to have modeled for them a pastor that, yes, was preacher, less was teacher, but also that modeled leading from within. So as a result of that, after the words of the elements were blessed, I would go to the back of the sanctuary and I would participate with communion with the congregation. Walk forward when they were walking forward. So we're sitting there one Sunday, and I didn't have to be the trailer, but I always wanted to be sort of at the end. And so we had a young man in our congregation. He was about 6'5", he might have even been taller. He was a very tall human. And so he goes forward, and I'm looking around and sort of assessing what movement's happening, and I'm going, okay. So I stand up, and as we're walking forward, I realize that, you know that energy that you can feel in a room? Well, here's this energy, and they're giggling. And what I realized was our very tall 6'2" woman was standing behind me. So here we had 6'5", 5 foot, 6'2". They even took pictures of it. It really was funny. And they were all trying to hold it in. They were like, you know, and you could just feel that energy of humor going on. And, you know, so get forward, take communion, go over, and before I did the prayer of thanksgiving, I said, come on, you guys, that was funny. And they busted up. They all started laughing. And they were like, yeah, it really was funny. It really looked funny. And then they started showing pictures and sharing pictures and stuff. So we wrapped up worship service. But the lesson for me there was that God's got a great sense of humor. And sometimes we come to communion broken. Sometimes we come to communion with a feeling of solemnity. And sometimes we just gotta laugh when we take communion. Sometimes we want to take a huge chunk of bread, and sometimes we want to be served. And all of that is okay, because God's present always with us. We all have stories about shared meals. It might be holidays, it might be Thanksgiving or Christmas, it might be Easter, it might be birthdays, it might be some special day in your life, but we all have those stories. And some of them might even be communion stories. I encourage you to take time with these stories. Find your own lessons in these stories. As we share communion this morning, as we wend our way home, as we move through the week, think about our own experiences. And be available to the lessons of faith and spirit and community that those experiences crack open for each of us. May it be so.